What's up, guys? Quick video. I'm going to try and keep it as quick as possible. However, some key points that I want to cover. And once we get through this video, you're either going to be lifting better, or if you're a coach, you're going to be coaching better. We've got the weightlifting workshops and the weightlifting course coming in the new year. Really excited for that. And as part of the process of putting the content together for this, I've been looking back over some of the earlier courses that I did to try to understand where some of these conflicting viewpoints and things come from. And one such course was the UKSCA weightlifting workshop. Now, since then, there's been a lot of courses, a lot of development that I've done with my own weightlifting. There's been a lot of sort of key texts and key influences that I've been looking into to make sure that, you know, the weightlifting performance for myself, but also coaching, is all completely making sense, and it is all following some of the key influences in the weightlifting world. The UKSCA workshop took a very different approach, and I want to highlight some of the key differences, because if you're either a coach going through this process or you are being coached by a coach that has been through this process, this is certainly something to consider, because you might be making some mistakes that are very easy to rectify, and it's just based on getting these basics right, understanding that, you know, some of the things that are textbook coaching cues may not quite be sort of the right thing that you need to do at the minute. So I know that was quite a long intro. Really, you know, I love love strength and conditioning in general. A really massive fan of the UKSCA and some of the content that they put out, some of the work that they do. But in this case, if you're wanting to maximize your weightlifting, then ultimately there's some changes that you need to make from the structure of what that course was when I did it. Now, it may have updated since, so I'm going back to around 2014. But again, hopefully some of you will take some value from this. Now, first thing that I wanted to say before I get into the detail of where are the key mistakes that I believe that they make in these recommendations and in these coaching cues, is the fact that the UKSCA course is inherently set up to add weightlifting for the ultimate purpose of improving athletic performance in sport in general. Weightlifting itself is for the sake of weightlifting. So there's obviously going to be some differences there in terms of, you know, how much focus we put on some of these lifts. But ultimately, weightlifting for performance is a key point of the UKSCA accreditation. It's something that gets really drilled in. And it's something that I see a lot of coaches really sort of buying into and coaching all of the weightlifting in that manner. And I think that needs to change. So, key points. With both the clean and the snatch, the UKSCA approach is to go through the first pull, and then it was to go into a transition phase, and then a jump position, and then a second pull. And granted, when I was on the workshop, the guys were running it, coached it really well. And it was made clear that this was something that moves through extremely rapidly. However, in the textbook and in the way that you have to sort of go about it for UKSCA, certainly back then, and again, may have changed by now, doesn't really matter, because a lot of coaches will have gone through this process that I'm describing now. We would think about this transition phase. Now, it makes complete sense to understand that we are trying to put in that stretch shortening cycle, and we're trying to move through all these positions really rapidly. However, as a coach, it's not something to coach. It's not something to really speak to your athletes about too much. Go through the key exercises, go through the key assistance exercises. But if you're trying to get people to, increase the speed of the ball throughout the lift and develop into a more powerful position, and you give them all this to think about, ultimately it's going to be too much. Drill the positions, drill the movements, and you will be able to produce much more successful lifting than, you know, spending too long thinking too much about this transition phase into a jump position, into a second pull. In any case, that phase is taught too early. So it's taught as soon as you clear the knee. And for most athletes, you'd have a hell of a lot longer that you'd be able to continue your first pull for if you want to maximize your performance in weightlifting. Now, making the argument that this is emphasizing the stretch shortening cycle, I don't buy that, because ultimately, the more you're thinking about putting this in at a sort of unnatural position, if you will, the more likely it is to actually slow the movement down and have the opposite effect. You still can hit the stretch shortening cycle without needing to talk about it, without needing to go into it, get the positioning right, and you will go through these movements. So that was the first part. Now, building on that, a lot of the UKSCA lifting is enhanced towards trying to coach this jump phase of the lift, trying to make sure that we get the stretch shortening cycle and we're going into a jump. Weightlifting is a little bit different to that. It's not quite that simple. Now, if we are trying to coach a jump, a loaded jump, let's coach a loaded jump. You know, there's simpler ways for your athletes to be doing that. There's simpler ways for you to be including that in your training program, and there's better exercises for it. Making that too much of a fundamental part of the actual lifts themselves, not really something to overthink about, and certainly not something that's going to enhance your lifting. Another point, again, both the snatch and the clean, and final point that applies to both, is that in the UKSCA it's very much sort of a brush on the thigh, or a brush at the upper thigh in terms of the contact that you make with the bar. Guys, it's going to be more than that. There is an active acceleration of the bar once you make this contact. We're certainly not thrusting into the bar, but I've seen too many errors made from people that literally brush the bar against the leg. There's no real contact, the body positioning isn't great, and the bar sort of does move in that complete straight line, but that's not actually what weightlifting looks like, and it's certainly not going to be optimizing the performance in these lifts. Now, something for the snatch only, the lockout position. UKSCA sort of used to really sort of drill home, pull apart the bar when you receive it, make sure that your elbows are pointed out along the bar. For some people, that cue can be a bit of a nightmare because it can actually lead to less stability, lead to you sort of dropping back. What we're actually looking to do is press up, and there will be an active internal rotation of your arm as you push up. Not too much. We're not sort of in this position that you might have seen in certain types of lifting before, but it is an internal rotation. If you're trying to sort of pull the bar apart, you can end up getting this external rotation in your shoulder and completely destabilize. So again, not a cue that I'd want to coach. Another point that actually applies to everything, foot pressure. We talk about foot pressure in all these different phases of the lift. Ultimately, all you really need to think about in weightlifting is that you want the foot pressure, ultimately mainly through the midfoot. When you're finishing the pull, when you're sort of in that top position and you're in that triple extension, obviously the pressure moves forward because there's no other part of your foot in contact with the floor that can apply force. So it needs to shift for that. Thinking about the weight jumping forward and back all the time, again, is not something that we need to really spend much time on. The majority of the time, your intention is to have weight mid-foot. The bottom of the squat position, whether it's the snatch or the clean, again, it's emphasized that the weight will be back towards your heels. That's probably going to lead to mistakes. Honestly, if you are comfortable with weightlifting, you probably know that you want weight, again, in this position, getting back towards mid-foot. So just something to consider, that shoving the weight back will probably lead you to dropping the bar forward in a clean, because it'll probably set your hips up a little bit higher than you'd like. Same in a snatch. So just something to be aware of. And ultimately, from a strength point of view, yes, it might be a little bit more sort of to engage your glutes and hammies, but if it takes your quads out of the equation, then it's going to be a weaker movement. In the jerk, last point, elbows high. So they say elbows same position as the front squat. So elbows are up here. And what is said is that if the elbows drop, it's going to lead to the bar moving out forward. Actually, we can afford to bring the elbows down and get full grip of the bar before going into the jerk. So elbows a little bit lower than a front squat position for me. What's the issue is if you get your dip wrong and you're leaning forward into it, then the bar's going to come out forward. That's not because the elbows aren't up here. That's because you're getting the positioning wrong throughout the movement. So it's a secondary effect, really. You can afford to bring your elbows down, and it's going to lead to a more forceful press and probably a better ability to lock it out in that split jerk position. Final point that I wanted to make, there's a couple of references in the UKSCA workbook and things to all athletes should learn to catch the bar in a full squat position, in a full squat, full overhead squat in a snatch, or in a full front squat in a clean. Guys, this is never ever an appropriate sort of thing to be doing. All athletes will have differences in terms of body size, body shape, and we need to work around that, and you need to work around it. Whether you're doing this lifting for yourself, you need to understand your own strengths and weaknesses. Whether you're a coach, you certainly need to understand your athletes. Saying that everybody should be able to do this is actually not necessarily the case, and it's certainly not the case that everybody will always lift more and be able to generate more force by doing this, because particularly tall athletes may really struggle to get into that position. Certainly if this is secondary, regardless of whether it's just weightlifting. If it's just weightlifting, some people will power clean more than they squat clean. Simple as. And if it's secondary, some people will potentially be putting the body through a hell of a lot of stress to try and force some positions that isn't really adding anything into their overall picture of the program. So some key points there that I wanted to cover. Hopefully I've summarized it quite well. The transition phase is far too much emphasis on this in terms of a coaching perspective. Get your first pull right, understand the explosion, and all the rest just happens. Foot pressure, again, we're sort of pinging the pressure back and forward throughout these sort of textbook definitions, when in reality we are trying to keep the pressure pretty much mid-foot throughout. Certainly when we're receiving the ball though in the squat, if you're trying to receive it with the foot pressure through your heels, is much more likely to lead to issues, and I personally sort of can't see a reason to be putting that in and emphasising that point. If anything, yes, it may be slightly further back in certain points of the movement, and slightly further forward, but that's a result of a combined mass of the bar and body position and things, rather than thinking about changing your foot position. And if it's something that you're talking to people about, or something that you're actively thinking about too much while you're doing it, unless there's obvious massive errors, then in reality you're probably going to overcompensate, and it's going to become an issue in the opposite way. For example, too much weight through your heels, you're going to lead to dropping the bar forward in a lot of cases. What else in terms of the summary? The snatch, make sure that we're locking out, getting that internal rotation, not excessive, but certainly enough to stabilise your shoulders, rather than trying to make sure that you're just thinking about which direction your elbows are pointing. Because yes, it's important, but at the same time, over-exaggeration of that leads to less stability, not more. And again, in the jerk, the fact that your elbows are dropping, yes, if you're trying to press it from this front squat position and trying to do your jerk from that position, fine. However, letting your elbows come down a bit to solidify the position first can actually be a massive benefit. It's just you don't want to be dropping your body position forward. You want to drop pretty much straight down and back up. And there's no universal sort of cues for all athletes. You've got to go with what works for you or what's working for your athletes. Guys, I hope that this video helps. I know that it's been slightly longer than I intended, but hopefully it covers some of the key mistakes that I see most people make. And when I look back at the actual sort of textbook definitions that we might have had to go through on some courses, then it makes sense as to why so many people are getting this so wrong. I hope that helps. Cheers.